Hello, and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is another lecture in our Intro to Critical Theory class. We are going to be dealing with Hannah Arendt's first chapter of On Revolution. This is the Penguin copy that I'm using here. So I'll reference, if I reference page numbers, that's what this is from. Um, Couple of things about Arendt before we maneuver into her text here. I think that as I've been sort of explaining in class, there are current critics within the field of what I would call critical theory. Folks like Samuel Moyn, for example, who has a new book on liberalism, so that'll be showing up. But also Wendy Brown is another person. And Gabriel Rockhill is another figure I've mentioned in class a number of times. And the critique of critical theorists, especially of the mid 20th century and the Frankfurt variety, or sometimes the classic critical theorists, or the first wave of the Frankfurt school, because then we get to Habermas and there's like a kind of second wave. One of the charges has been, on the from the right wing has been that they brought this kind of European nihilism. And Michael Walsh's book, The Devil's Pleasure Playground or Paradise, something I can't remember the name right now. I mentioned it in a previous lecture supported by Family Research Council. So I would call that a right wing um, attack that has basically positioned everything about critical theory as being wannabe leftist, or even not even just wannabe, just like the infiltration of the left to the university, especially American universities in the mid to late 20th century. A lot of charges going on right now against postmodernism, against people like Foucault, and we'll get to Foucault in a few weeks. And so the charges of leftism that's been the right wing's sort of mainstay. The charges, which I think are much more interesting, honestly, of late have been charges from either people who I identify as being on the left or even, far left or even in a true Marxian vein. And they have said that really what critical theorists did was they came to the United States and they aligned themselves with liberal capitalism and they became kind of complicit in this kind of form of liberalism that, at least according to someone like Moyne, and he's not, he has a chapter on Arendt in his book, um, that they helped actually to create the conditions, the kind of ground soil, if you will, for neoliberalism. And so we read Wendy Brown a few weeks ago, and neoliberalism has shown up, as I gave a different definition from another book from David Harvey, if you remember, in the last one of the couple last lectures. I can't remember right now. So when we look at Hannah Arendt, from those critiques, she seems to be kind of a bridge between that Frankfurt School version of critical theory that seems to align itself with Marxian types of readings, although we know, and I've stressed this over and over again, that they're building on Marx, right? They're adding something that they feel like was missing in Marx, and that missing thing was, for most of them, cultural critique of some sort or another. And so we saw last week with Walter Benjamin and with Horkheimer and Adorno from Dialectic of Enlightenment, we saw two angles or two approaches to critique culture itself, right? I put them into discussion with Glenn Coulthard and Wendy Brown. Glenn Coulthard being a contemporary indigenous thinker, Wendy Brown being a major thinker in terms of defending some sort of remains or something of liberalism within a really robust critique of neoliberalism. And then even before them, we looked at Emmanuel Levinas, who is not a classic critical theorist, but who was pointing to the same types of critique, especially from a Jewish perspective, I think, with the philosophy of Hitlerism that was published, a decade before the critical theorists were doing it. And I do that to make sure that to let us know that the critique is a broader milieu than just the Frankfurt School. That Levinas was taking a particularly religious critique, which probably seemed kind of weird because so many of these other thinkers are kind of like committed secularists. Um, and then putting that all together when we get to the folks who are refugees in the United States, like Horkheimer and Adorno, like Marcuse, I wanted to frame that critique and their suspicion that there could be a totalitarian takeover here because they had seen it happen in Weimar Germany, right? The suspicion wasn't because they were just nihilists bringing some sort of nihilism from post-war or in between wars Europe. It's for post-wars for most of them. I mean, we're starting to see writings that are being written during World War II last week, but most of them are still in Hannah Arendt, even in what we covered today, is going to be really looking back to what people call the First World War. So for I think from their perspective is that the Second World War is it's really just an extension or a breakout of uh, unresolved issues from the First World War, with of course much more catastrophe and the atom bomb and stuff like that that we will get to. So I've framed them. I want us to see them and read them in their historical context and understand why they might feel at first welcomed and, of course, relieved to be, accepted in the United States, but also while emphasizing that the United States didn't accept a lot of Jewish refugees. They got into the United States because of their academic background and their ability to contribute scholarly um, or to the State Department or the Office of Strategic Services if you're Marcuse. So there's probably, and just within the broader phenomenon for Jewish folks anyway, that there's maybe some survivor's guilt happening for these folks because they were able to get out of a horrible situation because people thought they were smart enough or and there have been TV shows recently about this kind of phenomenon. So I'm not going to go into their extraction from Europe, but just to set the precedent there. So what's interesting for Hannah Arendt in this book is she's turning to revolutions. So in the way that I've been framing the readings for this class, right, there's the cultural shift. Benjamin looked at the material history of art and artistic production, not to do bourgeois art criticism or to talk about the spirit of genius or individual expression or anything like that. He was using the medium of artistic production to show how fascism becomes the aestheticization of politics, right? And then leaves us with the little opening at the end that communism would be the politicization of art, but he doesn't tell us how to do art. Other Marxist artists are out there doing their thing, like Bertolt Brecht or something like that, and having the boom stand or something come into the camera. So anything that disrupts the natural, the seeming mystification of naturalism in a artistic production is going to be part of that Marxian technique to um, obliterate our false consciousness, right? Uh, and then we saw Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer in negative dialectics took kind of like Levinas's idea and went all the way back to Homer at the beginning of their book. We only read the mass culture chapter um, and we start seeing this mass media critique. It's very much a critique of Hollywood and propaganda. And this is a big production Hollywood, right? This is not people who are running around with 16 millimeter, like with like digital cameras making indie movies, right? That's like, that just doesn't exist at that particular time. And if you know anything about film during that time, it's actually really an interesting part of film history that when you get these left-leaning filmmakers in France, associated with the New Wave in the 1950s, you see a lot of choppiness. You see a lot of like pushing outside of studio production. And seeing in the film like Breathless by Jean-Luc Godard, you see Paris and you see there's a lot of jolting around, and that's supposed to be doing some of that left-leaning work, and it's also supposed to be leaning towards um, a kind of leftist kind of critique towards a more realistic approach to things. And then you have Italian like neorealism and the Bicycle Thieves, like right a film like that, which is definitely focused on real conditions, right? But it has a little bit of a different aesthetic, post-war aesthetic than Jean-Luc Godard and the Nouvelle Vague in the French way. So interesting things to be thinking about in terms of cultural history. Hannah Arendt is writing this book. This comes out in the early 60s. She's famous at this point. She is maybe even infamous at this point because of controversies about the way that she handled her coverage of the Eichmann trial in Israel, Eichmann in Jerusalem. I'm not going to go into that, but Hannah Arendt is definitely a figure um, who is so necessary for us to study in critical theory, but who has a conflicted background. She was, for a while, a lover of Martin Heidegger. They were intimate lovers. You can read their letters if you like. Um, she's largely responsible for Heidegger's thought being introduced to the United States. She alone, although I think that a lot of these other figures that we're studying are students of Heidegger's, and so they're all kind of reacting to Heidegger's thinking in terms of philosophy. Hannah Arendt is the one who brings us Walter Benjamin, and in the late 60s, she's editing the classic um, texts like Illuminations, Reflections. So without Arendt, we don't get access to a lot of these other thinkers as well. So she's just important historically for that reason. Famously, she came up with the phrase banality of evil for the Eichmann trial, saying, and she framed Eichmann as a kind of just like a pencil pusher bureaucrat who's just like, who had a lack of consciousness. And she thought that it was the lack of consciousness was the way to sort of explain um, uh, how Nazism got to take hold of such a wide populace of people, including high-ranking Nazis. For critics, many people wanted to see justice done to Eichmann, especially Jewish people, and especially Israeli Jewish people. And so, in trying to probe the question, they felt like Hannah Arendt had uh, almost been an apologist for Eichmann at times by making him seem less evil or less involved than he really was and is. And it does seem like from recent work that Eichmann, in other instances, is quite intentionally anti-Semitic and in a monstrous way. And throughout his life, and so it creates a tension between Hannah Arendt and um, her colleagues, some of her colleagues. It ends relationships, and then we see this whether or not there is, I can't probe the psychology of Hannah Arendt today, but whether or not, as an assimilated Jew, she really um, had a deep connection to Jewishness, but like, what does that even mean? Because like it's not just a religion. So when we're dealing with calling out people on how much of their identity is their identity, I think that that's a problem. And yet at the same time, I think that when we look back historically, I'm sure surely there were lots of people who were Jewish in background that just saw themselves as not, I mean, not even just assimilated, but just like culturally as thoroughly German, and didn't really think too much of their Judaism, except for that something about the racial policies of the Nazis meant that they were going to die because of it. So, um, yeah, is Arendt minimizing that sort of stuff in her larger work? That's just an open question, and I invite students to read more of her work. I just what I would like you to do is not to come down to a complete judgment on that sort of character aspect of art until you've read most or all of her work. As with like a lot of philosophers, yeah, we know that they might not have made the best political decisions for sure. It doesn't mean that they're not worth thinking with, even if it's to tell us like that maybe they did something wrong. So she's famous when this text comes out, and she turns her eye rather than Horkheimer, Adorno, and Benjamin to culture in the aesthetic sense. She turns to the idea of revolution itself. And so I in my syllabus, I said just read chapter one, but I do think I'm gonna cover a couple of things from that 10-page intro here, just because I think it gives us cohesiveness. Um, to her argument. And what she's trying to do in the beginning here is say that revolutions, while war has existed for all time, revolutions are relatively late in coming. They're from the past few centuries. And so they deserve to be studied and analyzed as kind of their own particular thing. Um, she says, wars and revolutions, as though events had only hurried up to fulfill Lenin's earlier prediction, have thus far determined the physiognomy of the 20th century. So she's talking about the now. What does critical theory do? Tries to analyze the present, tries to give us some sort of a, a pulse on the present, or place a finger on the pulse of the present. And as distinguished from the 19th century ideologies such as nationalism and internationalism, capitalism and imperialism, socialism and communism, which, though they still invoked by many justifying causes, have lost contact with the major realities of the world. War and revolution still constitute its two central political issues. They have outlived all their ideologies and justification. So that this is interesting, right? I think that already she's saying not communist, not capitalist, not like when we want to analyze the current moment, we can't either revert into the nationalisms or internationalisms of like the Communist Party, the International Workers' Party. I think she's clearly setting herself aside from that as not being necessarily Marxist, right? From the beginning. She's not hiding behind that. It's not like a ruse, right? She says wars and revolutions have outlived their ideological justifications. In a constellation that poses the threat of total annihilation through war against the hope for emancipation of all mankind through revolution, leading one people after another into swift succession to assume among the powers of the earth and to separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and the laws and nature's God entitle them, no cause is left but the most ancient of all, the one, in fact, that from the beginning of our history has determined the very existence of politics, the cause of freedom versus tyranny. Nice opening paragraph. She's going to have a lot to say about the laws of God and the laws of nature. And one of the current charges against these critical theorists is that even though they were Jewish, they actually really embraced a lot of a kind of return. And this is kind of a conservative thing in them, but they embraced a kind of return to Christendom or so-called Christian values in the natural law tradition, including the human rights tradition in the way that that embraces so-called natural law. And that's a kind of mistake, right? It's a turning of their backs on secularization. but also embracing perhaps the ways that Christianity has been tied to empire throughout the at least since Constantine, right? If not before. On page 2, she says, historically, wars are among the oldest phenomena of the recorded past, while revolutions, properly speaking, do not exist prior to the modern age. They are among the most recent of all major political data. In contrast to revolution, the aim of war was only in rare cases bound up with the notion of freedom. And while it is true that warlike uprisings against a foreign invader have frequently been felt to be sacred, they've never been recognized either in theory or practice, as the only just wars. Justification of wars, even on a theoretical level, are quite old, although, of course, not as old as organized warfare. Among their obvious prerequisites is the conviction that political relations in their normal course do not fall under the sway of violence. And this conviction we find for the first time in Greek antiquity, insofar as it is the Greek polis or the city-state defined itself explicitly as a way of life that was based exclusively upon persuasion and not violence. So what's hovering behind here is definitely a lot of Aristotle. She's very fascinated with Aristotle. Um, whether or not we want to debate those claims that she's just made, surely, yes, we see Aristotle's rhetoric and the emphasis on persuasion in Greek democracy. Um, uh, we also know that the Peloponnesian War, a way to sort of look at that was that Athens had become the hegemon um, during that period of history, which would be like before Aristotle's time. So how are we reading Greek history to think about that sort of thing? I also want to throw out, because I've mentioned it in other lectures with the Coulthard lecture, the tie-in of the doctrine of discovery, the papal bulls of the 14th and 15th century. At least from my reading, I feel like the way that just war was used in terms of doctrine discovery going, and it goes back to people like St. Augustine for sure, but the way that that was used, and in some ways continues to be used today, is something that I feel like Hannah Arendt misses. I don't want to critique her a whole bunch because I'm kind of covering her today, but I will say that from my perspective, when I'm reading this book right now, I feel like she has no sense of what the situation is for actually indigenous people in the United States where she's living right at this time. So there's a lack of sensitivity, is what I'm saying, to that. And that takes her back to her classical training in philosophy and Aristotle, um, which makes her really good at that. Like, I'm not contesting necessarily that, her ability to do that kind of philosophy, but she doesn't seem to have an awareness of indigenous people's struggles. And that's not only on her, that's on a lot of different people. But she wants to claim these kinds of origins, like almost she's telling the history of Western civilization, just as Horkheimer and Adorno were, right? So they are looking back and they're critiquing, they're trying to find out, why did something like totalitarianism or Nazism, is it the product of the so-called Western mind or not? Or could things have been gone differently? Is it the pinnacle of Western civilization, or did something go wrong? And we need to go back and reanalyze where we went wrong in terms of those of us who identify as so-called Westerners. I use the term Euro-Christian, but we can use Westerners too. She turns over from Greeks to Rome with Livy in the next paragraph. She says, last sentence of on that first paragraph on page 3, the notion that aggression is a crime and that wars can be justified only if they ward off aggression or prevent it acquired its practical and even theoretical significance only after the First World War had demonstrated the horribly destructive potential of warfare under the conditions of modern technology. And then she proceeds into the atomic bomb. And this is, of course, we're familiar with this. We should be in this course familiar with the critique of instrumental reason. She's not saying that wars weren't bloody in the past or that atrocities didn't happen in previous centuries, but she is saying that there is something different from the First World War on, and then with the lead up to the atomic bomb, to mass annihilation, and that we're drawing on human reason and human science in order to um, uh, 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 to destroy ourselves and potentially the rest of the planet. She moves on from there to the idea of total war. She says, quite apart from the threat of total annihilation, which conceivably could be eliminated by new technical discoveries such as a quote clean bomb or an anti-missile, there are a few signs pointing in this there are a few signs pointing in this direction. She says there is first the fact that the seeds of total war developed as early as the First World War, when the distinction between soldiers and civilians was no longer respected because it was inconsistent with the new weapons then used. So the civilian casualties of World War One completely destroy the idea of the polis. The polis was supposed to be the civic center that was supposed to be based on peace. She is not going in a Schmittian direction here, but you can almost hear in the background Carl Schmitt and like the friend-enemy distinction, which he relegates to international conflict and ties that back into to international law and war, and there's going to be an international law sort of situation going on there, but that's not exactly where she's going. But so this is her first point, is that the First World War changes things, and that um, uh, now just because the technology has been able to destroy so many people, it's not only soldiers fighting, it's just civilians who are caught up in the war as well. So she says this changes the army's role because the army really can't stop like an A-bomb or something. So she says, in contrast to the history of warfare in our century, could almost be told as the story of a growing incapacity of the army to fulfill the basic function. Until today, the strategy of deterrence has openly changed the role of the military from that of protector into that of a belated, essentially futile avenger. So we can't do anything about it. We except react after we have been attacked. And that causes us to build up and build up and build up in the name of prevention of something that we can't really prevent. Just the ability to handle things afterwards is kind of the way she's putting it here. Her second point here is that closely connected with this perversion in the relationship between the state and the army is second and little noticed, but quite noteworthy. The quite noteworthy fact that that since the end of the First World War, we are almost automatically expect that no government and no state or form of government will be strong enough to survive a defeat in war. Um, and we know, she's German. She has Germany's defeat in mind here as well, right? In the First World War and the Second World War. And so what happens with that defeat is other powers come in and they try to change the political situation, as with the Weimar Republic or with Adenauer and the Liberal Republic after World War II. Um, so a little bit further down in the paragraph, she says, however, a revolutionary change in government, either brought about by the people themselves as far as after the First World War, or enforced from the outside by the victorious powers with the demand of an unconditional surrender and the establishment of war trials, belongs today among the most certain consequences of a defeat in war, short of course, of a total annihilation. And of course, she has the Eichmann trial, the new war crimes, the new situation with the United Nations in mind as she's thinking about this and what it means to be defeated in war. She says, after the First World War, all governments live on borrowed time. third point, she says, seems to indicate a radical change in the very nature of war through the introduction of the deterrent as the guiding principle of the armament race. Here she's talking about the Cold War. Um, she says, in other words, the military are no longer preparing for a war in which the statesmen hope will never break out. Their own goal has become to develop weapons that will make war impossible. Um, then she maneuvers over, I'm just kind of skipping the paragraph here. She says, there's finally, and in our context, most importantly, the fact that the interrelationship of war and revolution, their reciprocation and mutual dependence has steadily grown, and that emphasis on the in the relationship has shifted more and more from war to revolution. Um, she talks about Second World War. She says 20 years later, it's become almost a matter of course that the end of war is revolution, and that the only cause which possibly could justify it is the revolutionary cause of freedom. So she's going to give a lot of attention to freedom in her work, and I've critiqued abstract notions of freedom, as has Wendy Brown earlier on in lectures here. So please pay attention and try and track what she means by freedom, right? Because I don't think it's the "don't tread on me" kind of uh or the kind of like Proud Boys, far right, alt right, whatever you want to call those folks. I don't think that that's exactly what she means by freedom here. So it's worth considering her concept of freedom. Um, where do I start here? She says, even if we should succeed in changing the physiognomy of this century to the point where it would no longer be a century of wars, it most certainly will remain a century of revolutions. In the contest that divides the world today and in which so much is at stake, those will probably win who understand revolution, while those who still put their faith in the power politics in the traditional sense of the term, and therefore in war as the last resort of all foreign policy, may well discover in a not too distant future that they have become masters in a rather useless and obsolete trade. The whole concept of war and how war is done changes, and we need to look at the concept of the revolution in order to understand that the only successful governments in the future are going to be the governments that understand what revolution is. She just basically sounds like she's doing like a foreign diplomacy policy report, right? Or a foreign, maybe even just like a Defense Department policy statement here, right? Because she is talking about how you win, right? That this is like on her mind, and thinks that we can't win if we don't understand what revolution really is. Now, of course, there are revolutions happening all over Africa during this particular moment. Israel is only a state after 1948 as well, and so the shifting sands in the what we now call the Middle East is also going on during this particular period. Not to mention Asia and the Far East, and what is eventually becomes Vietnam. So she maneuvers down to talk about the French Revolution and to talk about violence, that we need to have a particular kind of account of violence, how it works. And she contrasts that with her Aristotelianism, and the classic Aristotelian focus on humans as deliberative, speech-bearing animals. So she says, where violence rules absolutely, as for instance in the concentration camps of totalitarian regimes, uh, not only the laws, les lois cités, as the French Revolution phrased it, but everything and everybody must fall silent. It is because of this silence that violence is a marginal phenomenon in the political realm. For man, to the extent that he is a political being, is endowed with the power of speech. And so again, is this like this ties into a much bigger discussion, especially in Jewish communities, about how do we even speak or even talk about is it even possible to talk about the atrocities and the horror of the Shoah or the Holocaust, right? Is it so profound that it leaves us speechless and therefore should we be careful about trying to do representations, films, movies of this event because they reduce this unspeakable horror to an aestheticized formal representation in our minds, and then we feel like we can deal with it and move on. So this is very much like, a question of trauma on a sort of on a mass level. She says the two famous definitions of man by Aristotle, that he is a political being and a being endowed with speech, supplement each other and both refer to the same experience in Greek polis life. The point here is that violence itself is incapable of speech, and not merely that speech is helpless when confronted with violence. Because of this speechlessness, political theory has little to say about the phenomenon of violence and must leave its discussion to the technicians. For political thought can only allow the articulations of the political phenomenon themselves. It remains bound to what appears in the domain of human affairs, and these appearances, in contradistinction to the physical matters, need speech and articulation, that is, something which transcends a mere physical visibility as well as sheer audibility in order to be manifest at all. A theory of war or a theory of revolution, therefore, can only deal with the justification of violence because this justification constitutes its political limitation if instead it arrives at a glorification or a justification of violence as such, it is no longer political but anti-political. Whew, interesting stuff there. Of course, I think she has Nazi Germany in mind, that like once we have gone into this fascist realm, we've entered a kind of anti-politics. And in that way, I mean, I feel like there's a little bit of a thread that we could pull through towards what Wendy Brown says about the totalitarianism that's kind of the door that's open to it within neoliberalism. Uh, um, But of course, in Benjamin, he's going to call that same phenomenon the aestheticization of politics, or just glory for the sake of glory. We can think about Nazi pageantry and Nazi violence, and that once we've gone into that action, we're not in the theoretical realm. Again, implicitly here, I think there's a defense of critical theory and critical thinking and the idea of thought, right? And I think that that's all out throughout Hannah Arendt's work, like especially with the idea of the banality of evil, is that like what she thinks is going to save us is to be doing critical thinking and philosophy. And even going back to Aristotle, and that can seem, I think that especially to non-philosophers, I think that that can seem like really like almost naive uh like is that really what we should be doing? Like is that really the practical way of doing things? And I think that she, like Marcuse in this way, she says that we do need to push beyond this kind of anti-intellectualism. That is going to be necessary to give an account for all of these things. And yes, that is what's going to distinguish our ability to have consciousness around this kind of stuff, our ability to develop a conscience around this stuff is what is going to distinguish society from the banality of evil. Um, she turns here again, then in the last instance, to the idea of the state of nature, which is going to come up throughout her text. And so I need to emphasize what she says here. Although again, I will have a really different reading of this because of some of the more recent work that I've been doing. So she says, insofar as violence plays a predominant role in wars and revolutions, Both occur outside the political realm, strictly speaking, in spite of their enormous role in recorded history. This fact led the 17th century, which had its share of experience in wars and revolutions, to the assumption of a pre-political state called state of nature, which of course was never meant to be taken as a historical fact. Now, that's going to be something that comes up over and over again, is that the people who really want to rely on the state of nature theory will point back and say, like, even in Hobbes, even in Locke, they didn't really think that this was a really something that happened in historical time. It's just a kind of thought experiment, or it's just a heuristic way of framing things. But from an indigenous perspective, and because I think so much political philosophy has drawn on that, and because Locke says in the beginning, all the world was America. What does he mean by that? Um, uh, just that thought move already colonizes all indigenous peoples in the Americas into an idea of the state of nature. And then it doesn't really matter what happens to their bodies or what their perspectives are, because all they've been relegated to is the Eurocentric or Euro-Christian mind to begin with. And they're just like another phenomenon in nature, like anything else. And under liberalism, of course, like John Stuart Mill, indigenous people don't get to come to the table and have a conversation as a full-on political contender. They have to go through a cultivation process and a civilizing process that is, as my hand gesture is doing here, vertical and upward, right? So there's something about Euro-Christian thought, as Tinker and I have been tracing in our own work, that's top down, it's vertically based, it's about a kind of cultivation, and it's a vertical um, image schema that happens throughout the whole. It's in art, it's in philosophy, it's in discourse, it's in religion, and that is what constitutes for us something like the Euro-Christian worldview. Whereas, as Tink will say, indigenous worldview is collateral, egalitarian, and it is our deafness as Euro-Christians to because of colonialism, it's our deafness to indigenous perspectives that makes us think that things have only happened in one particular way. And it's Hannah Arendt's own kind of Eurocentrism and Western civilization centrism that makes her deaf to that as well. But she's going to emphasize that this was not, the state of nature was not a historical fact. She says its relevance today lies in the recognition that a political realm does not automatically come into being wherever men live together, and that there exist events which, though they may occur in a strictly historical context, are not really political and perhaps not even connected with politics. The notion of a state of nature alludes at least to the reality that cannot be comprehended by 19th century, the 19th century idea of development. So she does see that there was this kind of 19th century social developmental model, that civilization is part of that. The way that people use that word civilization is part of that notion of development. She says, no matter how we may conceive of it, um, whether in the form of cause and effect or potentiality and actuality or the dialectical movement, says Hegel, right? Cause and effect, the liberals, the people that Carl Schmitt is against, the positivists, legal positivists, cause and effect, potentiality and actuality, vitalism, that's Bergson, people like that, or even in the simple coherence and sequence in occurrences, just the pure historicist notion of history. She says, for the hypothesis of a state of nature implies the existence of a beginning that is separated from everything following it, as though by an unbridgeable chasm. And in the last paragraph of the intro, she says, she refers back to Cain and Abel and Romulus and Remus. Cain and Abel from the Hebrew Bible, Romulus and Remus from Roman mythology. And she says that what is founding and what we need to think about in terms of the founding of so-called civilization is a founding violence. And it's a fraternal kind of killing of siblings violence, in a universalized way of looking at Hebrew Bible, which I was teaching last week. um, what the Cain and Abel story tells us is that all slaying of another is a slaying of a sibling of humankind, um, and that there's choice in it as also as well, because Cain does choose. He's premeditated in his act. And then the twins, Romulus slew Remus. Violence was the beginning, and by the same token, no beginning could be made without using violence, without violating. The first record deeds in our biblical and our secular tradition, whether known to be legendary or believed as historical fact, have traveled through the centuries with the force which human thought achieves in rare instances when it produces cogent metaphors or universally applicable tales. The tale spoke clearly. Whatever brotherhood human beings may be capable of has grown out of fratricide. Whatever political or organization men have achieved has its origin in crime. The conviction in the beginning was crime, for which the phrase state of nature is only a theoretically purified paraphrase, has carried through the centuries no less self-evident plausibility for the state of human affairs than the first sentence of St. John, in the beginning was the Word, has possessed for affairs of salvation. Now, I've mentioned that recent critics, and Samuel Moyn being one of them, have seen some of the critical theory moves of Cold War liberals as embracing a kind of uh, conservative notion of Euro-Christian civilization in their attempts to defend liberalism against Nazism. Neoliberalism, which has been emerging as economic policy, according to Wendy Brown from the late 30s, is trying to do the same thing. It's trying to find a middle road between Soviet communism and right-wing fascism. So liberalism sets itself up to be this kind of middle way, right? Or third way. It makes sense to me that Hannah Arendt would go back to the virtue ethics and virtue philosophy of someone like Aristotle, because the Greeks, for him and for Epicureans as well, there's going to be always this notion of balance, right? Also, the idea of the good in Aristotle can't be figured out in his Nicomachean Ethics. It can't be figured out by just theorizing the good as a kind of eternal capital G good like it was in Plato. It's going to have to be worked out through practical philosophy. And this is what Hannah Arendt says is needing to occur. And in philosophical thought, the idea of the state of nature has developed as a concept for which to work with that stuff. It doesn't matter whether Cain or Abel, the Cain and Abel story is true, or the Romulus and Remus story is true, or the state of nature theory is true or not. It gives us a place marker from which to trace things. Now, you might have all sorts of critiques of that kind of just modality of thinking, and I think a lot of indigenous people and a lot of post-colonial scholars will say no, because the way that you have treated us as real humans is as if we do exist in a state of nature. It is your colonization of thought and of our minds, like Frantz Fanon is going to be saying, right? Like when Fanon says in um the piece covered by it's in Black Skin, White Masks, but it's also Wretched of the Earth, which we'll look at in a few weeks. But when Fanon um, says that, like, yeah, like under the current situation, the slave just gets freed, and then you're just is assumed to be free, right? So the slave no longer has master slave dialectic under Hegel doesn't work anymore because the slave has been freed, but the slave hasn't been freed in the slave's mind from the conditions of colonialism to begin with. And so we need to have a psychological account for uh, for the perpetuation of colonialism in our minds. And I think that that's a really powerful critique by a thinker like Frantz Fanon, who's completely like off is frequently misunderstood. And so we'll look at him in a few weeks. I think that this lecture it's not super long right now, but if I go into a very long chapter, right now, for Arendt, it's going to turn into really long. So I'm going to cut this off, and then I'll start a new lecture, to continue on with chapter one of of On Revolution, the meaning of revolution. So hope you have, if you're pausing between videos, have a great day, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever, whenever you are. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch up with you again shortly.